Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support this channel, its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. This video is part of a series entitled Questionable Witnesses, An Atheist Teaches Life of Christ. Today we'll be looking at Matthew 2, 13 through 18, where Herod kills the innocents and asking the question, did the slaughter of the innocents actually happen? I'm teaching the Gospels much like I did many times in my churches over the years as a pastor, but now I'm teaching it as an atheist. The whole issue of this series has been to get to how many witnesses do the Gospel accounts actually have, and are they credible? The Bible's low bar criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses is our first test. The next test is modern scholarship, which is a little more rigorous as to proving the truth or falsehood of claims and other criteria. Plus, I want to make any remarks to the story that I think are pertinent, and I also want to make some deconversion notes. The slaughter of the innocents appears in Matthew 2, 13 through 18. Let's read the text. Now when they had gone, referring to the Magi, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and stay there till I call for you. For Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod. This happened so that it had been spoken through the Lord by the prophet would be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi. He became very enraged and sent men and killed all the boys in Bethlehem and all its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they are no more. There is going to be a lot with this passage, but to note that according to Matthew 2, prophecies are fulfilled. I'll deal with the prophecies that are fulfilled in this passage along with the one about that the Magi inquired about later on in the video. But first we need to get to our criteria. Number one, the Bible's criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses gives us the same problems that we have had throughout this series when dealing with the life of Christ. Only Matthew tells us this story, and none of the other gospel writers to even bother to even copy it or even tell their own version. It is purely Matthew material. When you add that we don't really know who wrote Matthew, nor do we know who told the story to Matthew, the Bible fails to internally to provide 2 or 3 witnesses for the event, and would not even hold up under this low-barred standard that the Bible provides. When we turn to modern scholarship, of course, then it gets even worse. The events of this passage get even more doubtful, as we have no evidence outside of this passage that Jesus and his family even went to Egypt, period, let alone Joseph had a warning from God in a dream. But this is a part of a small, ordinary event, and since so perhaps we shouldn't expect too much here. But the slaughter of the innocents is an entirely different matter. An order by a King Herod is given and involves the slaughter of baby boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, which would both have been noted by someone, especially being that close to Jerusalem. But when we look at the other histories of Herod near the time or slightly after that, nothing. In fact, it may be noted, and has been noted by many, that Herod's atrocities were so well known, you could make up anything and it might stick. In other words, you could create a complete fabrication of something horribly he did and people would believe it simply based on track record. In short, it was easy to create fake news about Herod and have it be believed. More damning is the fact that Josephus does talk about Herod, and it's because of him we know the date of his death, January 26, 1 BCE. But there is no mention of the slaughter of the innocents. It would be a good boon and make it even historical if he had, but nothing. So once again, this event is only in Matthew. It's only recorded in Matthew by the writer of Matthew, and we don't even know who that is. What is clear is that the writer is not trying to be a historian, but to show how Jesus fulfilled prophecy. One thing that is known from archaeology, and I will make reference here to Paulogia's video on the archaeology involving Herod, which I'll link in the description, that Herod the Great was making the case that he was the Messiah, and the Herodians were born out of that. He did, after all, rule an independent Israel that may have kind of genuflected a knee towards Rome, but was still pretty much its own independent nation. He kept them out of direct Roman rule, and he reestablished them as a nation. This is the origin of the Herodians, which Jesus will confront later in Matthew 22, and which Mark also mentions. Matthew, however, unlike Mark, is the only gospel writer to attack Herod the Great directly with this story. The story not only claims that the prophecy was fulfilled by Herod's actions, but it also shows Herod as a monster, as somebody unworthy to have the title of Messiah. This is a deliberate attempt to discredit Herod as Messiah, that narrative, and at the same time exalt Jesus as the real Messiah, which is exactly what Matthew is trying to do with his gospel. Could Herod have slaughtered innocent baby boys in Bethlehem? Yeah, it's plausible. Did he actually do it? Given the only source we have is also deliberate propaganda against him, I would say then that this event is probably very questionable. Now some deconversion notes and some other things of note. In the whole overall story of the Magi coming to Jerusalem, the young family's flight to Egypt, and the slaughter of the innocents, Matthew uses three supposed prophecies that are being fulfilled: Micah 5:2, Hosea 11:1, and Jeremiah 31:15. In all cases involving the context of the verses, to whether they refer to Jesus or Messiah could be debated. In the case of Micah 5:2, the whole point was that Micah was giving a prophecy that a new ruler would rise from Bethlehem, which would be connected with David. Whether this directly connects to the messianic figure that the Jews had created in the first, second centuries, or Jesus himself, is simply a matter of Matthew's interpretation, not direct words of the prophet that say so. Micah 5:2 is a very general statement, and it only does one thing: says the ruler will come from Bethlehem. Otherwise, it is very vague about who this ruler will be. But Matthew really shows how fast and loose he will play with the biblical text when he uses Hosea 11:1. He completely pulls it out of context by omitting the first part of the verse. Hosea 11:1 reads, "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." It's a direct reference to the Exodus story and doesn't refer to an individual Messiah at all. It refers to Israel as a nation, metaphorically as God's son. I would say it was very doubtful that there are any messianic references here at all. In this one case, this is where the writer of Matthew is taking something completely out of context. To the point, it seems to show that the writer further may be fabricating narrative to fit the prophecy as well, to fit a desire to use as many prophecies finding fulfillment of Jesus as possible, even to the point of just grabbing anything that can be used post hoc. In short, let's take anything that will support my idea after the fact and use it. None of the other gospel writers even reference the idea that Jesus was in Egypt at one point. Honestly, most of the messianic narrative ignores it. It's not even really necessary for most of the messianic considerations of the time, but the writer of Matthew seems to think it is, so he puts this story in. This is the part of the story that I feel is most likely completely made up to fit the writer's objectives. Lastly, we have Jeremiah 31:15. The problem with this one is that Jeremiah doesn't seem to be doing anything other than addressing his own time. This is the time he's speaking, which is right after Israel has been defeated and many of its young men have been sent into exile. It would be more likely referencing that they are no more because they're in exile instead of the event in Matthew 2. Besides, the event is not recorded anywhere else, so it's likely it could be made up by Matthew's agenda of discrediting Herod as the Messiah narrative once again. It makes Herod into a monster and fulfills a prophecy according to Matthew. But this has a larger theological problem, that in order for Jesus to fulfill a prophecy, one of the requirements is that the babies have to die. In other words, God had to orchestrate the death of these innocents in order to demonstrate once again through prophecy that his baby boy in particular was the Messiah. A strange way for you to prove this and have to concoct this idea for a loving God. Like it or not, it shows God is not really concerned for the life of others, as they are only a means to an end. Even 2-year-old and under baby boys in Bethlehem are just a means to an end to make sure that everybody knows that Jesus is the Messiah. Once you see that the writers of the Gospels have their own agendas that cause them to use these prophecies out of original context with a lot of interpretive license, it begins to unravel for you. You can see the humanness of the Bible's writers. It really does get rid of the idea of it being inspired by God, and instead shows that these people had agendas and were willing to play fast and loose with their own text of scriptures that they held sacred in order to make their point. The other conversion issue is ancient history. In a general view, one of the areas where people claim the Gospels are history is an interesting point, as there are many cases no corroboration or collaboration or any kind of connection with the actual events is found in history. But it goes deeper than that. There are many events of antiquity that are disputed, but many of them still have more proof that they happened than what is presented in the Gospels. This became very problematic for me when I was researching all this stuff and doing the life of Christ in particular. I'm a little bit off script here, but one of the things that I have to make note of here is that there's a lot of people and events in historical antiquity that still have a lot of disputes about them and about the details in particular, but nobody disputes the general events because there are 2 or 3 witnesses of that event. Other people talk about it. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, is mentioned by some. Caesar existing, Julius Caesar existing, is often cited as an example. The writings that he has about his campaigns in Gaul can be questioned as to whether he's ego boosting himself up or actually presenting history. But the fact is, nobody denies that Julius Caesar invaded Gaul because there's other corroborating evidence that supports that. His existence is corroborated by his image on coins across the empire and mentions by other historians and things like that. And there's still a lot of things that are disputed about the life and person of Julius Caesar, but there's still more evidence for his existence. Even though some of the stuff is disputed, and even though some of the events of his life is disputed, there's still more evidence for that than there is in the Gospels for Jesus Christ. And that's one of the problematic things from a deconversion point of view you have to deal with. It seems strange to me that the supposedly most wonderful historical event, Jesus dying on the cross and then rising from the dead, is so important. And yet, from a history standpoint, it's almost like the guy didn't exist and is rather the product of mythology. And this would make sense much more if indeed he was the product of a lot of legendary mythological development. I've often said that, the use and the way the writers of the Gospels do things kind of actually calls things more into question than they do authenticate them. In this story, we have supernatural things like Joseph being warned in a dream. We also have prophecy that doesn't seem to fit the messianic narrative. It's almost like they're doing anything in desperation to kind of prove their point and hoping that people won't notice that perhaps they even made some stuff up. Could happen back then. There's no social media to double check things. And so you could get away with a lot. As I said, Herod the Great was known for his atrocities, so making up an atrocity that he did and saying it was him might simply be believed because of track record. This is a real problem from a deconversion point of view. One of the things that begins to unravel for you is this idea of the inspiration of the Bible. And a lot of apologists like to hitch the historicity of the Gospels with that inspiration. The problem is when you look at the historicity of the Gospels, it's very questionable. That's why this series is called Questionable Witnesses, because almost throughout the entire Gospels, I will demonstrate how that is so. But also this means that the whole narrative of because it's historical, it's also inspired, also falls apart, even though that doesn't really make any logical sense. Because if the Bible gets the history so wrong, which it often does, especially in the Gospels, then it doesn't seem that an all-powerful, all-knowing God inspired the text. This makes it very interesting for me when people try to uphold the historicity of the Gospels. It was one of the things that began to have a lot of questions for me when I was in Bible college and an apologetics class that never went away and eventually had to be answered, well, maybe they just made it up. Or maybe some person around a campfire made up the story and then Matthew grabbed it because it fit his narrative. And that's the real thing that we need to recognize here. The stories are included, the ones that we have saved, are included by the writer because they had an agenda. There may have been other stories about Jesus' origin, but they don't fit the prophecy. And so I got to shoehorn the prophecy with the event. And so I'm going to pick the events out of the oral tradition that fit my narrative and fit the prophecies I want them to fit to. This shows that the writers of the Gospels weren't just writing, they were editing. They were editing history. They were editing what they wanted to be there. And it demonstrates it in this story because we don't have anything like that. It's a believable story, I suppose, given the nature of Herod. But I don't think that nobody would mention it, especially considering that it's a heinous act of killing baby children, particularly baby boys. It seems very interesting that nobody else made a note of this in Herod's biographies or any talk about them, and he had many critics, but none of them mention this tale. And it seems to me that you begin to realize that maybe the gospel writers made some stuff up. Maybe a lot of the miracles and other things connected with Jesus' life are straight up mythology connected to an actual historical figure, maybe Jesus of Nazareth. But a lot of things had to be changed. The whole idea of adding the idea that Jesus went to Egypt and came back after after Herod the Great's death is kind of very interesting. It's kind of like, he had a mark out from him from the very guy that was claiming to be the Messiah, but he isn't really, because Jesus is. That really kind of fits that dramatic narrative, and adding, the whole idea of out of Egypt I called my son, and trying to he's putting stories together with prophecies he wants to show fulfill the Messiah. Well, that's real big post hoc, and it's also big. I might be making this stuff up to fit a narrative, or I might be picking a story out of the oral tradition that fits the narrative and leaving other stories in the oral tradition alone because they don't fit my preconceived narrative. Once you realize that the gospel writers have a very large agenda, it means they very much could be editing what they want to be in their gospels and what they want to exclude. And that is something that has to be considered. Well, at that point, it's kind of realize how human the Bible is and how human the gospel accounts are. There's nothing inspired about them. And once you lose that idea of inspiration of Scripture, I really have to wonder what your faith is based on. I always hear mainlined on, well, I know that the Bible's full of flaws and all this other stuff. So, but what do you base your faith on? Well, I base it on the stories of Jesus. Well, if the stories aren't true, then you really have no basis for your faith, do you? And, Paul recognized this and everybody else recognized it. If Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, you're of all people most miserable. It absolutely hinges on it being historical. But if already the accounts of Jesus' life, starting with his birth, are starting to be very, very questionable, I think we can safely start to conclude that maybe the whole thing is questionable. And maybe there might be some truth in it, and there might be some narrative that's good. But it all goes away. From a deconversion point of view, it starts to get really easy to dismiss the stories of the Bible as something with an agenda, something that could have been made up, something that's part mythology, part legend, and part historical fact. But how do you determine which is which? And why would a God who inspires this book not make it easy to determine which is which? That kind of gets rid of God being behind the book altogether. And that's how it ends for most of us. The more too many people come to this channel and think that I'm picking on Christianity. It's not that I'm picking on Christianity. It's what I know the best that I can demonstrate as falsest because of the knowledge that I possess. So I'm not trying to pick on you so much as to get you to see that it's very easy for people to get caught up in this because they want to believe it's true. But in the end, it doesn't really do you any good to have a lot of false hope. And a lot of us who hoped in Jesus once upon a time now have had to put our hope in other things. And lo and behold, there's other things to put your hope in. There's other things to do. There's other ways you can explain morality and living your life and having a purpose. And it doesn't require the gospel narratives to give you that. You could be a Christian and draw a lot of hope that God will guide you in a dream to keep you safe from this story. And this is how I would have preached the passage, that all kinds of things are chaotic around God's child, but God protects him by his supernatural power. I would have preached that as a Pentecostal. And even as a more moderate believer, I would have preached that. So, and this text illustrates that pretty well. But at the same time, is it real? Is it historical? And if it's not historical and it's not real, then I'm no more justified in placing my hope in this than the Havamal or the Bhagavad Gita or any of the other holy books that exist in other religions. On what basis do I adjudicate that this is truth if there's no historical accuracy to it, that the writers have an agenda? At that point, your faith begins to come undone. Well, thanks for stopping by for this one. I appreciate everybody who likes this video and comments on it. Always interested in your comments on what I have to say about this subject of the life of Jesus Christ. So, comment away. I enjoy reading them. It's a lot of fun. But if you want to support this channel, its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, you can PayPal link me. That's in the description. There's, of course, Super Chat, Super Thanks, which are always well appreciated and always welcome. But, of course, liking and sharing the video, doing the stuff that YouTubers do also gets this video noticed, and I always appreciate that. But the biggest way you can support the channel is become a member, become a citizen of the Rabyd Nation. Yes, I require you to buy your citizenship here. I'm just honest about it. That allows me to focus more on doing content like this and doing the deconversion live streams and things like that to help people out instead of appeasing the YouTube algorithm all the time. So thank you for all that have become a member. I appreciate all of you. You guys are great. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around, and so you want to take all your time, money, and opportunities and use them on yourself, the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.